two lovable little germ factories at home that like to bring home viruses, but I should be okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you again for having me. Again, my name is Matt Rogers, born and raised Rochesterian. I am a millennial, but a fun fact about me, it makes me feel ancient, is I was born in a hospital that no longer exists. And I was born here in Rochester. Bit of trivia, you've got two options. St. Mary's is one, I was not born there. Genesee Hospital is where I was born. My brother was born there too. Coincidentally, the wife, she is 6 days older than me, and she was born at Strong. But my dad and my father-in-law knew each other before Katie and I met, so it was kind of a match made in Rochester. A little more about me. I am the founder, fellow explorer of a company I started called the Lost Borough. It's a lesser-known nickname of Rochester, actually. A lot of people think, okay, how are you connected to New York City? Because of the 5 boroughs. There was a movement in the 1980s that gave us this nickname, the Lost Borough. A lot of people who are from Yonkers or know of the area of downstate think Yonkers is the Lost Borough and that's their nickname. That's not true. They are the 6th borough. Some people think Staten Island is the Lost Borough, but no, they are the Forgotten Borough. If you're catching on to how many questions I get about this, it's almost muscle memory in answering those. One of the things about me too that led me into this path of this mixture of creativity and history is I am an unrequited and terminal rail geek. Any city, country, area I'm in, I will always seek out the public rail, whether it's an incline, a trolley, a subway, an interurban, etc., etc. I always find myself gravitating towards those to explore any area I am in. How that connects to Rochester, and many people still don't know this, one of our best kept secrets is we are the smallest city or area in the world to ever have a functioning subway system. It has a little asterisk next to it because to continue that fact, we're the only city in the world to have a functioning subway system and then abandon it. From 1927 to 1956, it was only one line. It ran from the Rollins, which is kind of the neutral zone between Brighton and Pittsford. If you know where the Tom Walls is on Monroe Avenue, it's about across the street, all the way up to the General Motors plant up in Maplewood. For those of you familiar, or gearheads and familiar with Chevy Corvettes, Rochester carburetors, Rochester fuel injectors were well known, nationally well known between the GM plant in Maplewood and Delphi out in Henrietta. Another big question I get is, how do I know so much? I have the unique and very fortunate ability to remember what I have read, and I read a lot. Rochester, again, for being a mid-sized city, has so many people across our history from 1834 to present day, and even before 1834, where they saw what was happening and they had the good sense to write it down and to keep that memory alive in the form of books and pamphlets and stuff that we now refer to in historical societies and libraries. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about our black history in the Rochester area. I tend to focus a lot on city history. I did find a couple footnotes specific to Parma and Hilton that I will mention, but primarily we're going to talk about the urban core of Monroe County and how black history has paved its way through the years, starting with the very beginnings of this area almost into the modern day. Pioneers and renegades in this area. Before there was the Nathaniel Rochester, the Charles Carroll, the William Fitzhugh, we had a couple gentlemen in this area that were trying to make a living, and they were drawn to this area for one particular point in history, which was the 1779 Sullivan's Campaign. This was right after the Revolutionary War. General Washington at the time, in a way to punish the Haudenosaunee Nation, which was the Senecas, the Cayugas, the Onondagas, the Tuscarora, I'm missing 2 of them, but the Senecas is the most important because they were the nation that made up the majority of the Finger Lakes region. Washington told 3 of his generals, one of them being John Sullivan, to basically go from Albany across the western New York and push the Native American population out of the area as punishment, because during the Revolutionary War, 4 of the tribes of the Haudenosaunee Nation and 2 of them split their allegiances. 4 of them sided with the British, 2 of them sided with the U.S. or the American colonials at the time. A lot of those revolutionary soldiers started pushing west into our little slice of paradise, and they realized how fertile and worthwhile it was to come back there up in Rochester, Genesee Castle, this area here, that area was unexplored by non-Native American, non-indigenous tribes and nations. So a lot of these Revolutionary War veterans, after they finished this campaign, they remembered the Genesee Valley and they wanted to return. Two of them were a gentleman by the name of Captain Sunfish and Asa Dunbar. They were two of the earliest settlers in the region, and they happened to be black. Captain Sunfish was a soldier, supposedly an escaped slave, or escaped enslaved person. Not a lot is known about him because he tended not to stay in the same place for very long. He tended to travel between the Rochester region, the Buffalo region, and Canisius Lake. He was given his name by the Seneca Nation. He actually had a Seneca Nation wife, and they gave him the nickname Sunfish because when they looked into his eyes, it reminded them of the scales of a sunfish. So that's what the name he went by. He also went by Captain because evidently he had a boat on Lake Ontario that he would travel along the coast, sometimes into the mouth of the Genesee River. There are rumors that he might have practiced in some pirate activity and raiding activity, but that is unfounded. We don't know. And then we have another gentleman who we have many more records of, and this gentleman was known as Asa Dunbar. He was born in Braintree, Massachusetts as a free man. His parents were enslaved. They won their freedom. Massachusetts formally ended slavery much sooner than a lot of the other states did. He was still living in various parts of Massachusetts in a very diverse community before he, alongside Captain Sunfish and other Revolutionary War veterans, decided to head west. They had heard about I can't touch this too much. They had heard about all of this opportunity in the Genesee Valley, so decided to head west. Asa Dunbar headed there with his family. He moved there in 1791. He lived between Phelps and the base of Irondequoit Bay. At that time in 1791, if you can see the little blue markers there, those were all of Asa Dunbar's neighbors at the time. That's about how many people were living in the Rochester region. Dunbar and his family were here. If you've ever heard the name Oliver Culver, or one of the founders of Brighton, he was living here. I forget that there's reports that Sunfish had a property here, and at the very north, that dot is for the present-day Charlotte Lighthouse. William Hincter had left Massachusetts, and he had settled there right where present-day Lighthouse is. He coincidentally was escaping a rebellion. He was considered a rebel from the current United States government, and the reason why he left Massachusetts and settled here was that if federal agents ever came after him, he could very quickly make his way to Canada to escape. So those were Asa Dunbar's neighbors. And then all of a sudden, we had the very beginnings of another community that was sprouting at the base of Irondequoit Bay, which was the city of Tryon. The present-day map of where it would have been is right here. And there were two gentlemen that were founding that city, trying to create this port, this trading area that would service Lake Ontario and Irondequoit Bay commerce. And they asked Asa Dunbar to help establish that community. He is one of the signers that led to the charter of Tryon. He helped build most of it. Coincidentally, no photographs or etchings or any type of reproductions exist to show what he actually looked like, but we do know a little bit. He happened to be about 6'8" and over 300 pounds. Put that in perspective, I am 6'4". I am not a small person. Asa would have towered over me. So he literally helped build Tryon before Tryon disappeared, unfortunately. In 1796, he also helped establish the town of Northfield. Northfield would eventually become the modern-day towns of Brighton, Irondequoit, Henrietta, Penfield, Perrington, Webster, Pittsford, and the eastern part of Rochester. In the 1810s, he ended up moving to Canada after Tryon fell. But his grandson, George Erastus Dunbar, emigrated back to Rochester, settled in Irondequoit, and the town of Irondequoit has some pretty thorough records on the Dunbar family from Asa's grandson. So that is pre-Rochester Rochesterians. And I forgot I put that slide there, so that gives you a very quick bullets of what I just talked about. Moving forward, we start getting into the mid-1800s, 1820s, or 18 teens and 1820s, where you have three Southerners from Hagerstown, Maryland that looked to Rochester as another opportunity for investment. These gentlemen were Nathaniel Rochester, William Fitzhugh, and Charles Carroll. They also were Revolutionary War veterans. They were more on the administrative side. They didn't really fight or were combat veterans. Most of them were either clerks or they dealt in politics. After the Sullivan Campaign, after the rise of land speculation, and the Oliver Phelps and Nathaniel Gorham Purchase fallout, three war vets decided to invest in the Genesee Valley with a 100-acre tract. That was the common nickname for that area that would eventually become Rochester. The Pulteney Association, which was a British partnership, owned the Phelps and Gorham Purchase at the time, and a gentleman by the name of Charles Williamson is who advertised the lands to these three Southerners. Nathaniel Rochester was born in Virginia. His father died when he was 4. By the age of 21, he was a successful businessman. He was appointed major, then colonel in North Carolina to the militia. He was medically discharged from illness. He's the last of the three founders of Rochester to buy into this area. And he originally didn't make it all the way to Rochester. He stayed in Dansville, where he established most of the local community there, going so far as to literally draw out the plots for the community of Dansville that would grow into the city we know today. And he's the only founder that actually lived in city limits. He's the only founder that technically only lived in county limits of Monroe County. The other two gentlemen made it as far as Groveland and Sodus, and they stayed there. Charles Carroll is one of many Carrolls in the Carroll family. He had an uncle who signed the Declaration of Independence. He had a cousin who signed the Constitution, yet he somehow was not that instrumental in our founding of our federal government. He did live in Dansville as well for a time, and I'm losing my notes. He was very good friends with James Madison during the War of 1812. He was in the carriage that saved James Madison's wife from the British as the British were coming to the White House to burn it down. And then in 1815, shortly after, he moved his family to Williamsburg, which was near Canisius Lake. He sold all of the people he owned. Unfortunately, the three gentlemen that founded Rochester owned people. They were slave owners. And all but Rochester freed their slaves before they moved up to New York. New York had ended slavery in 1799, functionally ending it in 1827 because of how the law was written. People weren't freed until 1827. Both Carroll and Fitzhugh are buried in Canisius Lake. Rochester is buried at Mount Hope Cemetery. Coincidentally, there's virtually nothing on William Fitzhugh. All that I know from him is what the bullet points I could find. He did buy land in Dansville, Groveland, and Sodus. I made a point to mention his daughter, Rebecca. She ended up marrying a gentleman by the name of Dr. Jeremiah Backus. For any of you who have been to Genesee Country Museum, the Backus Fitzhugh house was the Dr. and Rebecca's house. Coincidentally, all three of these gentlemen were profiting in their lifetime from the act of slavery. Their children and their grandchildren were abolitionists and were fighting to free these people from their current predicament. So, in short, the cycle can be broken. That Fitzhugh Backus house at Genesee Country Museum hosted a number of abolitionist meetings and gatherings, and a lot of the docents out there at the museum can speak to it much better than I can. So complicated beginnings in Rochester, but it does have somewhat of a silver lining. Early Rochesterians I wanted to showcase for you guys are three folks that came to Rochester by different means. These were Reverend Thomas James, Austin Stewart, and Hester C. Jeffrey. All three of them were not born in Rochester, but they came and made their mark in the city and community itself. Talking a little bit about them. Reverend Thomas James was born near Utica. He was one of 4 children. His family was sold when he was 8. He was born into slavery. He never saw his sister and mother again, which is an unfortunate common practice in the act of slavery, but he reunited with his brother many years later here in Rochester. He did escape his predicament. He stayed in Canada until he was sure that he was going to be safe. He joined the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Society in 1821, where he learned how to read and write. And then he helped found the AME Zion Church in Rochester in 1832. That church still stands. It's in Cornhill neighborhood. He was ordained a minister in 1833. He was assigned a number of different congregations between Syracuse, Ithaca, out in Kentucky, and then he returned to Rochester, Massachusetts as well. One thing of note for Reverend James is he did ordain Frederick Douglass as a preacher within the AME Zion Church. He was instrumental in the Civil War as a missionary when he was in Kentucky. He was supervising prisoner camps, liberating enslaved people, performing marriages between Union black soldiers and formerly enslaved women to aid women in their legal freedom. And he died in 1891 in his home on Tremont Street. Austin Stewart is another another person that escaped slavery and came to Rochester to make his fortune. He learned to read in secret as a house servant, but he was discovered, and that was discouraged and stopped. But when he was in Rochester, he worked for a manumission society, which was a society dedicated to freeing enslaved people through the legal processes. He started a meat market and general store on Front Street. For those of you who are familiar with downtown and the UFO-looking building, First Federal Plaza, there is a park next to it, which used to be all concrete. It was Charles Carroll Plaza. Originally, that was Front Street. That was the original economic hub of Rochester. Coincidentally, Charles Carroll's Plaza, when it was just recently renovated, it is now renamed as Austin Stewart Plaza. He gave a speech. He was the guest of honor and gave a speech on July 5th, 1827, which was the formal official day that New York freed every enslaved person and completed the abolition of slavery. He also made his fortune. He became one of the richest people in Rochester, not just richest black person, but richest overall. And he moved to Canada to start to support what was called the Wilberforce colony, just north of Lake Huron, I believe, where a number of escaped slaves were trying to create this community. Unfortunately, he returned almost broke because the endeavor bankrupted him. He did write a couple books. One of them was 22 Years a Slave, 40 Years a Free Man, published in 1857, and he unfortunately died of typhoid fever in 1869. Hester Jeffrey is not a Rochesterian, but she has close ties to this area. She was born to free parents in 1843, lived in Boston for a time where she married her husband, Roswell Jerome Jeffrey, moved to Rochester in 1890, and she got to work. And that is a horrible understatement. This is just the number of clubs and organizations she was a part of, or organized or heavily involved in. She was Political Equity Club, Women's Christian Temperance Union, National Association of Colored Women's Club, New York State Federation of Colored Women's Club, Needlework Guild of America, Susan B. Anthony Club for Black Women, the Climbers, and then her own organization, Hester C. Jeffrey Club for young black women. She was a personal friend of Susan B. Anthony, and she was the only non-diplomat to give a eulogy at Susan B. Anthony's memorial service in 1906. She moved back to Boston in 1908 after her husband died, where she taught music with her niece, and she died in 1934, and she's buried out in Massachusetts. So talking about the Underground Railroad and people looking to escape their predicament and escape slavery, we had a number of areas in this, the city itself, Monroe County, and the greater region. As you can see, almost every town in Monroe County was involved. The universe doesn't want you to see right now. There we go. Including Hilton. And a fun anecdote I found was there was a house on South Ave here in the village. Gideon and Mary Archer housed escapees on their way to a gentleman by the name of Walter Vaughn. Walter Vaughn was a fisher. He had a boat right at the very end of North Avenue, which is that 259? Yeah. Yes. And there's a historical marker there, but the story goes that, excuse me, the Archers would house escapees on their way. Oh, that is very unfortunate. They would house escapees on their way to Walter. Walter would row them out into the middle of Lake Ontario. Canadian ships would be there to grab them, or to transport them further on to Canada and permanent freedom. That is...
There's no signal.
Yeah, let me see if this goes. Because I'm staring at this. Oh, fantastic. So, a local point here in Hilton. Traditionally, for people coming up from the southern tier and into the city itself following the Genesee River, that's why you had a number of houses that are just off of the river here. Yes, they can't travel the river in its entirety because unfortunately we have 3, and at that point there were 4 waterfalls that would have made that trip a lot more adventurous. So they had houses and barns and other areas that they would stop in, and they would travel by night. The dot in the middle there is the modern day Maplewood Rose Garden and Kelsey's Landing. That was one of the jumping off points that if escapees could make it to that point, they would get in a boat, continue up Genesee River into Lake Ontario and onto their freedom. There is a historical marker at the Rose Garden that talks a little bit about that. Frederick Douglass was involved in the Underground Railroad. The Post family, which is where the modern day Hochstein Music School is, had a home that they were heavily involved in it, and a number of other, other initiatives. It lasted till about 1865, December 6th of 1865 specifically, because that was the federal abolition of slavery. That's Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation address, where he formally freed all enslaved people. The Confederation still had a word to say about that, but the Union decided it at the very least. Speaking of Frederick Douglass, we have the Douglass family. I won't go into a lot of specifics about Frederick Douglass himself. Not only did he write 3 autobiographies, but his life is very well documented. I do want to talk a little bit about his family, though, which is less recognized. Starting with Anna Murray Douglass. She was born in Denton, Maryland. She was born free. Her and her 4 younger siblings were born free. Her parents and her 7 older siblings were enslaved, but they earned their freedom and were living in Maryland at the time. Her trade was laundry. She was a laundress, a housekeeper, and she eventually learned how to mend shoes to make a living. She aided Frederick Douglass's escape. For those of you familiar with Douglass's story, he disguised himself as a sailor to make his way from Maryland to Massachusetts, and it was Anna Murray who provided him the costume or the outfit to do that. She and Douglass settled down in Massachusetts, followed Douglass to New York, where they were married in 1838. She was very active in abolitionist movements between Boston and Rochester. She herself was a station master of the Underground Railroad. She maintained the finances and provided stable income for the family as Douglass toured and gave speeches. He was away for months at a time. She maintained the household. There are stories that if escapees were coming to the Douglass home at 3 in the morning, she was sure to have a warm meal and clean linens for them at all hours of the day. She, coincidentally though, is rarely mentioned in any of Douglass's 3 autobiographies, and they seemed estranged, the Frederick and his wife Anna, by about the peak of his popularity, yet she still supported his overall mission. To put it in kind of a quip, is she built the foundation for which Frederick Douglass could build his legacy. Frederick Douglass and Anna ended up having 5 children. The first 4 were Charles Lewis Frederick Jr. and Rosetta. Charles was born in 1844. He's named after his father's friend, Charles Lennox Raymond, who was an abolitionist. He attended public school in 1847 in Rochester. Rochester did not segregate public school until the following year in 1848. He delivered North Star newspapers for his father growing up, and he's the first black man to enlist in the U.S. military service in New York, volunteering for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. He rose to first sergeant within the cavalry. He had gotten sick. He could not perform his duties in the infantry, so he switched to cavalry. He was discharged by Lincoln in 1864 due to poor health and by request of his father. He became active in the Washington, D.C. National Guard very soon after. He served as a clerk, consul, and examiner for various government agencies, retiring after 53 years in government service. Lewis Douglass was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He served in the same regiment as his brother Charles, and Lewis actually rose to Sergeant Major of the Union Army, which was the highest possible rank that a black man could achieve in the Army. He was medically discharged in 1864 along with his brother, moved to Denver, Colorado to learn typesetting with his brother Frederick Jr., taught writing and reading and other subjects to adults while there, moved back to DC, and he became the first black typesetter for the U.S. Printing Office. Frederick Douglass Jr. Was apprentice at his father's newspaper for a time. He was a typesetter, editor. He was recruited into the Army as a recruiter, especially focusing on free black men to serve in the Union Army during the Civil War. He was the main recruiter for the infantry regiment that his two brothers enlisted in. And he continued serving in various government positions until his death. Rosetta Douglass was born in 1839. She's a little bit older than her brothers. She was tutored by Abigail Lydia Mott in Albany, where she learned to read and write. She was a critical thinker like her father. And one of the things I like to mention about Rosetta is she is the reason we know Anna Murray Douglass's story. She wrote in 1900, "Her Mother as I Know Her," recounting all of the contributions that Anna made to her husband's cause that otherwise would have been lost. She made a point to write that down and spread the news that it wasn't just Frederick Douglass doing this. He had a solid rock and foundation, and that was his wife and her mother, Anna. My mother, as I recall her. And then there was a time that Anna Murray Douglass died. She, I forget what she contracted, but she died of illness. And Frederick Douglass spent about a year and a half in deep depression until he met a woman by the name of Helen Pitts, who ended up becoming Douglass's second wife. Pitts was born in Honeoye Falls in 1838. Her parents were abolitionists and suffragists. She taught at the Hampton Institute, a school for black men and women. She was very public in her disdain for local residents harassing and abusing her students, leading to a lot of those residents getting arrested. She was hired by Frederick Douglass to clerk for the Recorder of Deeds office in DC, aided him greatly in his work professionally and personally, because he was also writing one of his autobiographies at the time. This is rumored to be about when they started becoming much more familiar with each other. Coincidentally, also, when she moved to DC to work for Frederick Douglass, she moved next door to him. His residence, Cedar Hill in DC, one of Douglass's neighbors was Helen Pitts' uncle. Douglass and Pitts were married in 1884. This was about a year and a half after Anna died. Obviously, the marriage was controversial. Frederick Douglass once quipped that this proves that I am impartial. My first wife was the color of my mother, and my second wife is the color of my father. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a strong supporter of the marriage, came out publicly and voiced her support of it. Frederick Douglass, when he died, he left his Cedar Hill estate to Helen, but unfortunately there was a problem with the will. There weren't enough signatures and witnesses to it, so legally she was not privy to that estate, but she spent the rest of her life working to make Cedar Hill a memorial and historical association, which it eventually became. I did say a little bit that they did end up having 5 children. Anna, or Annie Douglass, unfortunately died in childhood. She was born in Massachusetts in 1849. She did attend desegregated public school in the Wedge, right on Hickory Street, if you're familiar. I think it's the Gregory Park condos. That was the Elwinger and Berry Elementary School, and before that it was the, I forget the farmer's name. His last name is Munger. It was known as the Munger School. Frederick Douglass petitioned the Rochester Board of Education to allow her to attend classes. She did die when she was 10 years old. She had a 3-month battle with an unnamed illness that she unfortunately succumbed to. So starting to move into the 20th century, in the early 1900s, we have the Great Migration from about 1910 to about 1970. You had a lot of families in the South that were moving out of the southern states due to Jim Crow laws and basically being unwelcome. We only had the abolition of slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation about 50 years before that, and people were starting to find other opportunities. The first wave coming in the early 19-teens, They were starting to fill the roles left behind by soldiers as they were leaving for Europe in World War I. The second wave saw the same thing, except it was for World War II. From 1910 to 1940, there were manufacturing jobs open in the major manufacturing hubs of the North, from New York City all the way to Pittsburgh, and further west into Chicago and Detroit. 1941 to 1971, you saw further migration of black families all the way to the West Coast in Portland, Seattle, LA, and San Francisco. The second phase of the Great Migration saw the rise of some very controversial residential policies, which I will get to in just a moment. But the first wave of people moving out of the South is when we start to see larger black families coming to the Rochester area and settling in different parts of the county, in different parts of the city, primarily in two neighborhoods, one of them being Cornhill neighborhood and one of them being the Upper Falls neighborhood. Also in the 19-teens all the way up to the 1970s, we do have a sports element here in Rochester. We have two teams that have connections to this area. The New York Black Yankees and the Rochester American Giants. The Black Yankees were a member of the Negro League. The Rochester American Giants were a minor league member of the Negro League. The Black Yankees primarily played their baseball in New Jersey and Yankee Stadium for most of their existence, from 32 to 1947. Coincidentally, and I'm not 100% sure why, but their last year in 1948, they played at Silver Stadium here in Rochester. Rochester American Giants played in the 1940s and 50s. They also played at Silver Stadium, and they were a minor league team affiliated with the Negro League. Bright spot in Cornhill area that we have is a very strong community growing with that Great Migration and other black families and members coming to Cornhill neighborhood. Cornhill originally was known as the Ruffled Shirt District. It was where the upper crust, the money, was in Rochester. However, for reasons that I could be a complete smartass about, it wasn't upper crust enough. So they started moving to the countryside at that time, now known as East Avenue. So that left a void in Cornhill, a lot of open land, opportunity, and houses for families to move in. So that became a very strong black community right there in the main stretch of Cornhill, known as Clarissa Street at the time. Coincidentally, it's not the main stretch anymore, but at that time it was. There were famous jazz clubs along Clarissa Street, from the Python Club, the Elks Club, Dan's Restaurant, Squeezers, and others. Python is probably the most famous. For those of you who remember Chuck and Gapman Joe, they cut their teeth in the Python Club. There's actually an urban legend that Stevie Wonder, as he was rising to fame, he had heard about Rochester's jazz scene. He came up here. He was trying to get into the Python Club. He was still a kid at the time. He was underage. The guy at the door basically told him, you're not old enough to come in here. Stevie Wonder tried to prove that he could play, and the bouncer made a bet with him, saying, if you can play every instrument in this house, you can stay. And apparently he did. Unfortunately, I don't have confirmation of that story, but it does make for a really good anecdote. The community of Clarissa Street was almost entirely sufficient. There were restaurants, taverns, churches, social clubs, funeral homes, groceries, tailors, cleaners, auto repair, cobblers,